What's up, y'all? It's Adam here with Liber, and today we're going to take a closer look into the world of vermouth. Today we're going to let you in on some insights that professional bartenders understand and utilize, and that we think would be useful for you at home. Okay, so first things first, what is vermouth and how is it made? At its most stripped down, vermouth is a fortified and aromatized wine. To fortify a wine means to add alcohol to an already alcoholic wine base. Usually in the case of vermouth, this added alcohol comes in the form of brandy. This additional alcohol is going to serve a couple of purposes. For one, it's going to obviously change the way the wine tastes, but it's also going to help to preserve that wine. A vermouth that has that added brandy might give you an additional 2 or 3 extra weeks of lifespan. So what is it to aromatize a wine? Aromatizing wine is really just a fancy way of saying to infuse the wine with herbs, spices, fruit, or really any other flavor imparting thing you can think of. As you can imagine, the ingredients chosen to aromatize a vermouth are gonna have a huge impact on its ultimate flavor profile. Okay, so it's probably here that I should mention one of the most traditional ingredients in vermouth, wormwood. So vermouth actually gets its name from the German word for wormwood, which is like Wermut or vermouth with a W. Vermouth eventually became vermouth with a V, and then as it kind of migrated over to neighboring France, became vermouth, which is what we still know it as today. So even though wormwood itself is not necessarily in all vermouths today, that plant family, Artemisia, it still legally has to have an extract from that plant family in the ingredients list to be considered a vermouth. Broadly speaking, there are 2 categories of vermouth. There are your red vermouths, which you'll sometimes see as Italian-style vermouths or sweet vermouth. And then there's your white vermouth, which is often called French-style vermouth or dry vermouth. Now, before y'all blow up the comments section, I want to stress again that these are not rules, but generalizations. There are some white vermouths that are sweet, and there are some red vermouths that are relatively dry out there. The more familiar you become with vermouth, the more some of these rules and exceptions will make some sense to you. We're gonna start with red vermouth. Red vermouth often gets its color from a base of red wine. Sometimes white wine is used for the base of a red vermouth and color is added. And then also whatever's chosen to aromatize the vermouth will influence its color as well. Often red vermouth is described as having like a rounder, sweeter, richer profile than its white counterpart. Some red vermouths can be fruit forward, and they almost always contain more sugar than white vermouths. In cocktails, red vermouths are super versatile, and because they often have these big, complex flavor profiles, they really complement darker aged spirits like whiskeys of all kinds, rums, and even aged agave spirits. So I have 3 examples of red vermouth here that I think captured the spectrum of red vermouth pretty well. I'll start with what I might call the most straightforward of these 3, and this is Dolin's Vermouth de Chambray Rouge. It's light, has some citrus elements to it, but it's not overly spiced, it's not overly complex. It's got a really nice balance between being lightly sweet, maybe even a little bit floral, but it does have some of those baking spice characteristics that we talked about. I think about maybe drinking this one by itself on the rocks, maybe with a little bit of soda. In a cocktail, it's gonna do just fine, but it's not gonna stand up to some bigger, bolder flavors quite as well as maybe these other 2 will. Next up, I chose a slightly bolder, more complex example of a red vermouth, and this is Cocchi Vermouth de Torino Rouge. This is another red vermouth. It's on the sweet side. It's gonna have a little bit more of that kind of hallmark bitter agent or bitter flavor profile that vermouths can have. And if you're looking for, like, maybe you've explored the category a little bit and you're looking just for something a little stronger, a little more complex, a little more on the herbal and spice forward side, this is an awesome example. Same goes in cocktails. It's not gonna dominate, but this will stand up maybe to some rye whiskeys or some more aggressively flavored aged spirits. I also love this one with some soda and like an orange twist. Just it's refreshing, but brings the same level of complexity sometimes you'll just find in a full-blown cocktail. The last red vermouth I want to talk about is Carpano Antica formula. This vermouth is super on trend these days. It's a really old recipe, and I think it pushes the kind of boundaries of complexity and boldness further than these other two do. It's sweet, but it also has some gentian and cinchona in there that give it a bitter edge that show up in cocktails in a big way. This one really tastes like a luxurious vermouth. It's something that you drink and you kind of know you're tasting something pretty special. Now let's turn our attention to these white vermouths. As you might have guessed, white vermouth uses a white wine base. Most generally, there are two styles of white vermouth. There is Blanc in French or Bianco in Italian, both of which are lightly sweetened. And then there is dry vermouth, and those dry vermouths really most closely resemble the base wine. Generally, when compared with red vermouth, white vermouth is going to be lighter, a little more delicate in flavor, and it's going to bring some minerality and acidity to cocktails or on its own. So I want to start with Dolin de Chambéry dry vermouth. This Dolin Dry is made using a base of Uni Blanc grapes, which kind of have a high minerality, a little bit of salinity to it. They only use like 15 different herbs and aromatics for aromatizing this vermouth. So if you recall, that's about half of what they used in their red vermouth. That's going to make this dry vermouth a lot closer to the base wine than the red vermouths we talked about earlier. There's a little bit of like alpine spice here. It's going to be at home in cocktails with clear spirits mostly. The next white vermouth I want to talk about is also a Dolin vermouth, and this is their Blanc style. So if you recall, the Blanc style white vermouth is sweetened to a point somewhere between the dry vermouth that we just talked about and some of the red vermouths that we spoke about earlier. And that addition of sugar is gonna tease out some of the kind of fruitier notes here. The Blanc style is usually on the floral end of things, so you're gonna get things like orange blossom, maybe elderflower. I really love these Blanc style vermouths in highball cocktails because I think that carbonation really wakes up the floral elements in this vermouth. So the last white vermouth I want to talk about is an Italian Bianco style vermouth. This Italian Bianco style in general is going to be very similar to that French Blanc style we just talked about. I usually find that where the Blanc tends toward the floral, the Biancos push like vanilla, spice, and a little bit more ripe fruit, so think apple and pear. I generally find that, like the Blanc, this Bianco, these lightly sweetened white vermouths work better in cocktails for me, or at least are more versatile in cocktails than a dry vermouth. I just think that a little bit of an additional amount of sugar just gives it a boost, and they really stand up a little bit more. There really are so many amazing cocktail recipes that feature vermouth as a key ingredient. The Negroni, the Corpse Reviver #2, the Americano. The list really is immense. But today I want to zero in on two cocktails that I think everyone should at least try. The Martini, which uses a dry white vermouth, and a Manhattan, which uses a red sweet vermouth. Let's start with the classic dry gin martini. Fundamentally, a classic martini is just a combination of gin and a dry white vermouth. Super simple, right? But it's really in the ratio of these two ingredients where martini magic happens. So to get started, put a cocktail glass in the freezer. Next, grab a mixing glass and add some ice. I like my martini pretty stiff, so I'm gonna add 2 ounces of a London Dry style gin. Feel free to experiment with any gin you like. That's really part of the beauty of dialing in your favorite martini recipe. Next, I'm gonna reach for the Dolin Dry vermouth, and I'll add 1 ounce of that to the mixing glass. The last step is optional, but I love a couple of dashes of orange bitters for some depth. All that's left to do is to give this a 15 to 20 second stir and make sure everything's well combined and chilled, and then strain into that chilled cocktail glass. Sometimes I like to gild the lily and add an expressed lemon peel garnish. It's a really nice touch. This really is a transcendent cocktail. Feel free to experiment with ratios until you find something you really love. The Manhattan has its origins in the mid-19th century in, you guessed it, New York City. Start off by putting a cocktail glass or coupe into the freezer. Next, add ice to a mixing glass and then add 2 ounces of rye whiskey. Bourbon, Canadian whiskey, and even Scotch could be used here, but rye is super traditional and is definitely my favorite choice. Next step, add 3/4 of an ounce of sweet red vermouth. For this recipe, I'm gonna go with the Carpano Antica formula. Last step is just a dash or two of aromatic bitters. I'm gonna use Angostura here. Give this a good 15 to 20 second stir and strain into your chilled glass. A brandied cherry or expressed orange peel are both great garnishes for this classic Manhattan. So I hope you get out there and explore vermouth. Would also love to hear about any vermouth discoveries you might make, or if you find a vermouth cocktail that you love, let us know in the comments below. If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe for more awesome cocktail content. Cheers.